So you've got a Liberal government in New South Wales, a Liberal government, who brought down a budget only a couple of months ago. They boasted about it, but it embarked on a $27 billion spending spree. $27 billion. The growth in spending, was 26.5%. The gross debt, $182 billion. And in a budget of $95 billion, there were only $32 million in savings. Then in Queensland, where they're awash with royalties from the high prices being paid for coal and oil and LNG, they're still running a deficit of more than $1 billion. But they've got house prices, stamp duty there in Queensland. Queensland, as you're listening, was more than $9 billion greater than in the last financial year. But the government's borrowings in Queensland will go from $54 billion last financial year to $87 billion in 2025-26. It's a rise of 66%. Mind you, the New South Wales net debt in the same time's climbed 200%. So, Daniel, who is pulling these governments into line?
Well, that's a good question, Alan. And the issue is very few people. Don't forget, when we go back 1 or 2 decades, corporate Australia, for example, was much different. Corporate Australia would help lead the debate on economic reform, help lead the debate on long-term economic interests. Now they're just as bad as governments.
They've got the handout. Got the handout.
Very rarely hold.
Yeah.
They get the handouts. They're on the tit of government. And same as when we've got media, the media is doing a very poor job because, of course, so many journalists have an interest in currying favour with the government of the day so they get the good stories. So they're less likely to hold government to account than in the past. So this is not just a failure of politicians. This is a failure of Australia's governing and economic institutions. You rightly pointed out the significant failures of the Reserve Bank when it came to managing the cash rate and interest rates. We've also got a massive failure of Treasury, which has been telling governments to spend, rather than reducing the spending and paying down the debt. So unlike 2 or 3 decades ago when we had good economic management and the institutions of our society were at least making the debate and making the case about why we need economic reform, today we have basically a corporatist set up in our nation where all the main governing institutions of our society benefit from this massive government spending. Just to take one example, as you know, Alan, the billions and billions each year that are handed out to renewable energy companies, the solar and wind subsidies, no one's going to complain about that because they benefit from those subsidies. Multiply that right across our society and our economy. There are more and more people than ever before in our nation that rely on government subsidies for their own well-being, and so they're not going to call it out. And so this is the key issue that we face.
Absolutely. Great to talk to you, Daniel. I mean, as you made the point before, there's only one answer to retire it. You either increase taxes or you reduce spending. What do you want? No one in government wants to talk about either. Daniel, you and I will continue to talk about it. It's always good to talk to you. And thank you for the work the IPA are doing. But out there, who in government is listening? Daniel Wild, the Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs. See you next week, Daniel.
Pleasure. Thank you, Alan.
Daniel Wild, fluent, informed, but government, who's listening?